In the dusty basement of the Chicago Historical Society, archivist Dr. Sarah Mitchell was cataloging a collection of photographs donated by the estate of a recently deceased collector when she came across something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The photograph, dated October 13, 1891, showed what appeared to be a typical Victorian family portrait taken in Graceland Cemetery. A well-dressed family of 5 stood solemnly before an ornate headstone, their faces bearing the stoic expressions common to photography of that era when exposure times required absolute stillness. The father, tall and distinguished with a thick moustache, stood behind his wife, whose elaborate dress and carefully arranged hair spoke of considerable wealth. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were positioned in front of their parents, the youngest appearing to be no more than 6 years old. It was a formal, unremarkable family portrait of the type that filled countless albums from the late 19th century. Yet something about this particular photograph made Sarah pause in her cataloguing work. Perhaps it was the unusual setting. While family portraits were common, taking them in a cemetery was decidedly unusual, even for an era that had a much more intimate relationship with death than modern society. The headstone behind them was elaborate, carved from what appeared to be white marble with intricate floral designs and a weeping angel perched atop its peak. The inscription was partially visible but difficult to read in the sepia-toned photograph. Sarah held the photograph closer to the desk lamp, squinting to make out the details. The family's positioning seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if they were paying respects to whoever lay beneath that ornate marker. She turned the photograph over, hoping to find some notation that might explain the unusual circumstances of its creation. In faded pencil, someone had written, "The Whitmore Family, Final Portrait, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago, October 13th, 1891. May God forgive us all." The cryptic message sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Final portrait. The phrasing was ominous, suggesting this might have been the last photograph ever taken of this family. But what did the plea for forgiveness mean? Sarah's curiosity was immediately piqued. As a professional archivist with over 15 years of experience documenting Chicago's history, she had developed an instinct for recognizing when a seemingly ordinary artifact held extraordinary secrets. This photograph, with its unusual setting and mysterious inscription, practically screamed that there was more to the story than met the eye. She carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and set it aside, making a mental note to research the Whitmore family once she finished cataloguing the rest of the collection. But as she continued her work, her eyes kept drifting back to that haunting image. There was something about the children's faces that bothered her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The youngest child, a girl with ringlets and a white dress, seemed to be looking not at the camera but slightly to the left, as if something had caught her attention just as the photographer was taking the picture. Her expression was one of confusion, perhaps even fear, rather than the composed solemnity expected in formal portraits of the era. The 2 boys, while maintaining the required stillness, had a tension in their postures that suggested discomfort beyond the normal awkwardness of posing for a photograph. The older boy's hand rested on his younger brother's shoulder in what might have been a protective gesture, while his eyes held a wariness that seemed far too mature for someone who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. But it was the parents who truly unsettled Sarah upon closer examination. While their faces maintained the expected stoic expressions, there was something in their eyes that spoke of profound grief, and perhaps something else. Fear. Guilt. It was difficult to determine, but whatever emotion they were suppressing, it was powerful enough to be captured even through the formal constraints of Victorian photography. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her cataloguing work. The photograph seemed to exert a magnetic pull on her attention, drawing her back again and again to study its details. She had handled thousands of historical photographs in her career, but none had affected her quite like this one. There was an undeniable sense that she was looking at something significant, something that had been waiting decades to be discovered and understood. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Sarah set aside her other work and turned to her computer. If the Whitmore family had been prominent enough to afford such an elaborate cemetery portrait, there should be records of them in the Chicago Historical Archives. She began with a simple search for the family name, limiting her parameters to the late 19th century. The results were immediate and disturbing. The first entry that appeared was a newspaper headline from the Chicago Tribune, dated October 15, 1891, just 2 days after the photograph had been taken. Prominent family found dead in mysterious circumstances. Whitmore tragedy shocks Chicago society. Sarah's heart began to race as she clicked on the digitized article. The story that unfolded was one of the most bizarre and tragic cases in Chicago's history, a mystery that had never been solved and had been largely forgotten by time. According to the Tribune's account, the entire Whitmore family had been found dead in their mansion on the morning of October 14, 1891, less than 24 hours after the cemetery photograph had been taken. The circumstances of their deaths were so unusual that the police had initially suspected murder. But the evidence pointed to something far more inexplicable. Charles Whitmore, the family patriarch, had been a successful businessman who had made his fortune in the grain trade. His wife, Margaret, was known for her charitable work and had been a prominent figure in Chicago society. Their 3 children, Thomas, age 12, William, age 9, and little Elizabeth, age 6, had been well regarded in their social circle and attended the finest schools the city had to offer. On the morning of October 14th, the family's housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, had arrived for work to find the front door of the Whitmore mansion standing wide open. Concerned, she had entered the house and discovered a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The entire family was found in the main parlor, arranged in a circle on the floor, their hands joined as if they had been conducting some sort of ritual or ceremony. There were no signs of violence, no indication of struggle, and no evidence that anyone else had been in the house. The family appeared to have simply died simultaneously, their faces bearing expressions of what the coroner described as profound terror. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but medical experts of the time were baffled by how 5 healthy individuals could have suffered simultaneous cardiac arrest with no apparent cause. Even more disturbing were the reports from neighbors who claimed to have heard strange sounds coming from the Whitmore property throughout the night of October 13th. Several witnesses described hearing what sounded like digging, as if someone was excavating in the garden behind the house. Others reported seeing strange lights moving through the windows and hearing voices that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than from within the house itself. When police investigated these claims, they found evidence of recent excavation in the Whitmore's backyard, but whatever had been buried there appeared to have been removed. The earth was disturbed in a pattern that suggested something large had been unearthed and taken away, but there was no indication of what it might have been or who might have been responsible for its removal. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling from what she had just read. The photograph she had been studying showed the Whitmore family on what appeared to be the last day of their lives, posed in a cemetery for reasons that were becoming increasingly sinister. The inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us all," suddenly took on a much more ominous meaning. She returned to the photograph, studying it with new eyes. The family's positioning, which she had initially interpreted as formal and ceremonial, now seemed desperate, as if they were seeking some form of protection or absolution. The fear she had detected in the children's faces was no longer a product of her imagination, but a documented reality captured just hours before their mysterious deaths. But what had driven this prominent family to take such an unusual photograph, and what connection did it have to their tragic end? Sarah knew she needed to dig deeper into the story, to uncover the secrets that had died with the Whitmores over a century ago. She expanded her search, looking for any additional information about the family's final days. What she found was a series of increasingly disturbing reports that painted a picture of a family in the grip of something far beyond ordinary fear. In the weeks leading up to their deaths, the Whitmores had reportedly been behaving strangely. Servants had given notice, claiming that the house had become unbearable to work in. They described hearing voices in empty rooms, finding objects moved from their proper places, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate the entire property. Margaret Whitmore had been seen visiting various churches throughout Chicago, speaking with priests and ministers about matters of spiritual protection and the possibility of consecrating private property. She had also been observed at the Chicago Public Library, researching topics related to burial practices and the proper handling of human remains. Charles Whitmore had made several unusual business transactions in the days before his death, liquidating assets and making arrangements that suggested he was preparing for some sort of extended absence or emergency. He had also been seen at Graceland Cemetery on multiple occasions, often accompanied by men who appeared to be laborers or excavation workers. The children had been withdrawn from their schools after reports of disturbing behavior. Young Elizabeth had been found talking to empty corners of rooms, claiming she was speaking with the lady who lives in the ground. The boys had become increasingly agitated and fearful, refusing to sleep alone, and insisting that something was trying to get out of the basement of their home. As Sarah pieced together these fragments of information, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Whitmore family had clearly been dealing with something that had terrified them to the point of desperation. The cemetery photograph, taken on what would be their final day, seemed to be connected to whatever had been driving their increasingly erratic behavior. But what could have frightened a wealthy, educated family so thoroughly that they would resort to what appeared to be some form of supernatural protection? And what was the significance of Graceland Cemetery in their story? Sarah decided to research the cemetery itself, hoping to find some connection between the Whitmores and a particular location where their final photograph had been taken. Graceland Cemetery had been established in 1860 and had quickly become the final resting place for many of Chicago's most prominent citizens. The elaborate headstone visible in the photograph suggested that whoever was buried there had been a person of considerable importance. Using the cemetery's historical records, Sarah began searching for graves that matched the description of the headstone in the photograph. The distinctive weeping angel and ornate floral carvings were unusual enough that they should be relatively easy to identify if the grave still existed. After several hours of searching through digitized cemetery records and historical photographs, Sarah found what she was looking for. The headstone belonged to a grave marked for one Constance Blackwood, who had been interred in Graceland Cemetery on September 15, 1891, less than a month before the Whitmore family photograph had been taken. The timing was immediately suspicious. Why would the Whitmores have chosen to take their family portrait at the grave of someone who had been buried just weeks earlier? Sarah delved deeper into Constance Blackwood's history, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. Constance Blackwood had been a woman of considerable mystery and controversy in Chicago society. Born in 1823, she had arrived in Chicago in the 1850s with no family connections and no clear source of income, yet she had quickly established herself as a person of influence and wealth. She had never married, had no known relatives, and had lived alone in a mansion that rivaled those of the city's most prominent families. What made Constance truly notorious, however, were the rumors that had surrounded her throughout her life. She was said to practice what polite society euphemistically called unconventional spiritual beliefs, which contemporary accounts suggested involved rituals and practices that were considered deeply disturbing by the standards of the time. Several prominent Chicago families had reportedly consulted with Constance over the years, seeking her assistance with matters that conventional medicine and religion could not address. These consultations were always conducted in the utmost secrecy, and those who visited her were said to leave either completely satisfied with the results or utterly terrified by what they had witnessed. The circumstances of Constance's death were as mysterious as her life had been. She had been found dead in her home on September 10, 1891, but the condition of her body had been so unusual that the coroner had initially refused to issue a death certificate. According to the limited records that survived, Constance's body had shown signs of what could only be described as extreme age, as if she had aged decades in a matter of days. Even more disturbing were reports that her body had been found in a state of partial mummification, despite the fact that she had been alive and apparently healthy just days before her discovery. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes due to advanced age, but several witnesses had noted that this explanation made little sense, given that Constance had appeared to be a woman in her 60s rather than someone approaching 70. The burial of Constance Blackwood had been a hurried affair, conducted with minimal ceremony and attended by only a handful of individuals whose identities were never recorded. The elaborate headstone that marked her grave had been commissioned and installed immediately after her burial, paid for by an anonymous benefactor who had insisted on the specific design elements that made it so distinctive. Sarah stared at the information she had uncovered, trying to make sense of the connections between Constance Blackwood and the Whitmore family. The timing of events was too precise to be coincidental. Constance had died on September 10th and been buried on September 15th. The Whitmore family had taken their cemetery photograph at her grave on October 13th and had been found dead on October 14th. Something had clearly transpired between these two events, something that had driven the Whitmores to seek out Constance's grave and ultimately led to their mysterious deaths. But what could have connected a prominent business family with a woman who was rumored to practice dark arts? Sarah decided to search for any records of interaction between the Whitmores and Constance Blackwood during her lifetime. What she found was a series of financial records that told a disturbing story of desperation and increasingly dangerous bargains. According to bank records from the Chicago Mercantile Bank, Charles Whitmore had made several large payments to Constance Blackwood throughout 1890 and into 1891. The payments had started modestly but had grown progressively larger, culminating in a massive transfer of funds just 1 week before Constance's death. The purpose of these payments was not recorded in the bank's files, but their timing coincided with a series of tragedies that had befallen the Whitmore family throughout that period. In late 1889, the Whitmores had lost their eldest son, Robert, to a sudden illness that had baffled doctors. In early 1890, Margaret Whitmore had suffered a miscarriage that had nearly cost her life. Later that same year, Charles's business had been threatened by a series of inexplicable setbacks that had brought him to the brink of financial ruin. Each of these tragedies had been followed by a payment to Constance Blackwood, and in each case, the Whitmore family's fortunes had taken a dramatic turn for the better. Robert's death had been followed by an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative. Margaret's recovery had been remarkably swift and complete. Charles's business had been saved by a series of fortunate coincidences that had eliminated his competitors and opened new markets for his products. The pattern was unmistakable. The Whitmores had been paying Constance Blackwood for services that had somehow reversed their misfortunes. But the cost of these interventions appeared to have been escalating with each request. The final payment, made just before Constance's death, had been large enough to bankrupt most families, suggesting that whatever the Whitmores had asked for had required an enormous price. But what had they requested that had cost so much, and why had Constance died so soon after receiving payment? Sarah suspected that the answers to these questions lay in the mysterious excavation that neighbors had reported hearing on the night of the Whitmore family's death. She returned to the newspaper accounts of that night, looking for any additional details that might provide clues about what had been unearthed from the Whitmore property. What she found was a brief mention in a follow-up article that had been published several days after the initial reports of the family's death. According to this later account, police had discovered that the excavation in the Whitmore's backyard had been conducted with professional precision, using tools and techniques that suggested the involvement of experienced grave diggers or archaeological workers. The hole that had been dug was approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, dimensions that corresponded exactly to those of a standard burial plot. More disturbing still was the discovery of fragments of wood and metal in the disturbed earth, materials that appeared to be consistent with the remains of a coffin or burial container. Chemical analysis of soil samples had revealed traces of embalming fluids and other substances commonly used in the preparation of bodies for burial. The implications were horrifying. Someone had apparently exhumed a body from the Whitmore property on the night the family died. But whose body had been buried there, and why had it been removed? Sarah suspected that the answer lay in the connection between the Whitmores and Constance Blackwood, and in the mysterious services that the family had been paying for over the course of more than a year. She decided to research Constance Blackwood's background more thoroughly, hoping to understand what kind of services she might have provided that would have required the burial and subsequent exhumation of human remains. What she discovered was a trail of evidence that led back to practices that predated Chicago's founding and drew from traditions that most people preferred to forget existed. Constance Blackwood, it appeared, had not been her original name. Records from New Orleans, where she had lived before coming to Chicago, identified her as Constance Laveau, a name that carried significant weight in certain circles. She had been the niece of Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, and had inherited not only her aunt's knowledge of traditional spiritual practices, but also her reputation for being able to accomplish what others considered impossible. The services that Constance had provided to her Chicago clients were rooted in traditions that combined elements of West African spirituality, European folk magic, and Native American shamanism. These practices often involved the manipulation of spiritual forces through the use of physical objects, including human remains, which were believed to serve as conduits for supernatural power. According to the fragmentary records that Sarah was able to locate, Constance's specialty had been what practitioners called debt magic, a form of spiritual intervention that could reverse misfortunes and grant desires, but only at a cost that would eventually come due. The price for these services was not always monetary. Sometimes it involved the client's willingness to serve as a vessel for spiritual forces that required a physical presence in the material world. Sarah began to understand the true horror of what had happened to the Whitmore family. They had entered into a series of agreements with Constance Blackwood that had saved them from various tragedies, but each intervention had bound them more deeply to obligations that they had not fully understood. The final payment, the one that had preceded Constance's death, had apparently been for a service so significant that it had required the ultimate sacrifice. But why had the family taken their photograph at Constance's grave, and what had driven them to excavate whatever had been buried on their property? Sarah suspected that the answers lay in the specific terms of their final agreement with the mysterious woman who had held so much power over their lives. She returned to her examination of the photograph, studying it with the knowledge she had gained about the true relationship between the Whitmores and Constance Blackwood. The family's positioning at the grave now seemed less like a formal portrait and more like a ritual of some kind, perhaps an attempt to fulfill the terms of their agreement or to seek protection from consequences they had finally begun to understand. The inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us all," suggested that the family had come to realize the true nature of what they had done. They had sought help from forces that operated outside the bounds of conventional morality, and they had finally understood that the price for that help was going to be higher than they could bear. But what had been buried on their property, and why had it needed to be removed? Sarah suspected that the answer lay in the nature of the final service that Constance had provided for them. If her specialty was debt magic, and if the Whitmores had been accumulating spiritual debts over the course of more than a year, then their final request might have been for a way to transfer those debts to someone else. The thought sent a chill down Sarah's spine. If the Whitmores had arranged for their spiritual obligations to be transferred to another person, then whoever had been buried on their property might have been an innocent victim who had been sacrificed to pay for the family's accumulated debts. The excavation on the night of their death might have been necessary to complete the transfer, ensuring that the spiritual forces they had been dealing with would have a new vessel to inhabit. But if that was the case, then what had happened to the remains that had been removed from the Whitmore property? And more importantly, what had happened to the spiritual forces that had been bound to those remains? Sarah realized that she needed to find out more about what had happened to the Whitmore property after the family's death. If her theory was correct, then the spiritual forces that had been involved in the family's destruction might still be connected to that location, waiting for an opportunity to find new vessels for their influence. The records she found painted a disturbing picture of a property that had been unable to find stable occupants for more than a century. After the Whitmore family's death, the mansion had been sold to a series of owners, none of whom had remained in residence for more than a few months. Each new owner had reported strange phenomena that had driven them to abandon the property, including unexplained sounds, moving objects, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate the entire building. By the early 1900s, the mansion had gained a reputation as one of Chicago's most haunted properties. Several attempts had been made to demolish the building, but each effort had been plagued by accidents and setbacks that had forced the work to be abandoned. The property had eventually been sold to the city, which had planned to convert it into a public building, but those plans had also been abandoned after a series of incidents that had injured several workers and city officials. The mansion had stood empty for decades, slowly deteriorating as the city struggled to find a use for a property that seemed to resist all attempts at renovation or redevelopment. It was finally demolished in the 1960s, but even that process had been marked by unusual accidents and delays that had convinced many of the workers that the property was genuinely cursed. What particularly interested Sarah was the discovery that the demolition crew had found additional evidence of excavation in the basement of the mansion. According to their reports, there had been clear signs that someone had been digging in the foundation of the building, creating a network of tunnels and chambers that extended far beyond what would have been necessary for normal construction purposes. The crew had also reported finding fragments of human bone and other organic materials in these excavated areas, suggesting that the basement had been used for purposes that were far from conventional. The discovery had been reported to the police, but no investigation had been conducted, and the materials had been disposed of along with the rest of the demolition debris. Sarah realized that the Whitmore mansion had been the site of activities that had continued long after the family's death. Someone had been using the property for purposes that involved human remains, and those activities had only ended when the building was finally destroyed. But who had been responsible for these activities, and what had they been trying to accomplish? She suspected that the answer lay in the identity of the person whose remains had been buried and then exhumed from the Whitmore property on the night of the family's death. If she could determine who that person had been, she might be able to understand the true nature of the spiritual forces that had been involved in the Whitmore tragedy. Sarah decided to search for missing person reports from the period immediately before the Whitmore family's final payment to Constance Blackwood. If someone had been sacrificed to pay for the family's spiritual debts, then there should be a record of their disappearance around the time that the final arrangement had been made. What she found was more disturbing than she had expected. In the weeks leading up to Constance Blackwood's death, several people had disappeared from Chicago under circumstances that had never been explained. These disappearances had all involved individuals who were unlikely to be missed by society: homeless people, recent immigrants with no family connections, and others who existed on the margins of the city's social structure. One case in particular caught Sarah's attention. A young woman named Anna Kowalski had disappeared on August 28, 1891, just 2 weeks before Constance Blackwood's death. Anna had been a recent immigrant from Poland who had been working as a domestic servant for various wealthy families in Chicago. She had no family in America and few friends, making her an ideal victim for someone who needed a person who would not be missed. According to the police report, Anna had last been seen leaving the home of her employers on the evening of August 28th. She had been carrying her few possessions and had told the other servants that she had found a new position with a family that would provide better wages and living conditions. She had never arrived at her supposed new job, and no one had been able to identify the family that had allegedly hired her. The description of Anna in the police report matched the dimensions of the excavation that had been found in the Whitmore's backyard. She had been a small woman, approximately 5 feet tall, and weighing less than 100 pounds, which would have required a burial plot of exactly the size that had been dug and then emptied on the night of the family's death. Sarah felt sick as she realized what had likely happened to Anna Kowalski. The young woman had probably been lured to her death by someone acting on behalf of Constance Blackwood, killed as part of the ritual that would transfer the Whitmore family's spiritual debts to an innocent victim. Her body had been buried on the Whitmore property as part of the magical working, and then exhumed when the transfer was complete, and her remains were no longer needed for the ritual. But what had happened to Anna's remains after they were removed from the Whitmore property, and what had become of the spiritual forces that had been bound to her through the ritual of debt transfer? Sarah suspected that the answers to these questions were connected to the continued strange activity at the Whitmore mansion in the decades following the family's death. If Anna's remains had been moved to the mansion's basement, then the spiritual forces that had been bound to her might have remained active there, waiting for an opportunity to find new vessels for their influence. The thought that these forces might still be active, even after the mansion's demolition, was deeply disturbing. If the spiritual debts that had destroyed the Whitmore family had been transferred to Anna Kowalski, and if those debts had never been properly resolved, then they might still be seeking fulfillment through other victims. Sarah realized that she needed to find out what had happened to the demolition debris from the Whitmore mansion, particularly any human remains that might have been discovered in the basement. If Anna's body had been moved there after her exhumation from the backyard, then her remains might have been disturbed again during the demolition process, potentially releasing the spiritual forces that had been bound to them. The records she found were fragmentary, but they suggested that the demolition debris from the Whitmore mansion had been disposed of in several different locations around Chicago. Most of the building materials had been taken to conventional landfills, but some items, including what were described as archaeological materials, had been transferred to the Chicago Historical Society for evaluation and potential preservation. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized the implications of this discovery. If human remains from the Whitmore mansion had been transferred to the Historical Society, then they might still be in the building where she worked. The spiritual forces that had been responsible for the Whitmore family's destruction might be present in the very archives where she had discovered the photograph that had started her investigation. She immediately began searching the Historical Society's acquisition records for any materials that had been received from the Whitmore mansion demolition. What she found confirmed her worst fears. In 1967, the Historical Society had received a collection of items from the demolition site, including what were described as bone fragments and other organic materials of potential archaeological significance. These materials had been catalogued and stored in the Society's basement storage facility, where they had remained undisturbed for more than 50 years. According to the records, no one had ever requested access to these materials, and they had been largely forgotten as the Historical Society's collection had grown and evolved over the decades. But there was something else in the records that caught Sarah's attention. The acquisition had been accompanied by a letter from the demolition foreman describing unusual incidents that had occurred during the removal of materials from the mansion's basement. Workers had reported hearing voices and seeing figures that disappeared when approached directly. Several crew members had quit the job, claiming that they felt as if they were being watched by unseen presences. Most disturbing of all was the foreman's description of the condition in which the bone fragments had been found. They had been arranged in specific patterns within the basement chambers, surrounded by symbols that had been carved into the stone walls. The arrangement suggested that the remains had been part of ongoing rituals that had continued long after the original burial. Sarah realized that she needed to examine these materials immediately. If her theory was correct, then the bone fragments in the basement storage facility were the remains of Anna Kowalski, and they were still bound to the spiritual forces that had destroyed the Whitmore family. The fact that she had discovered the photograph of the Whitmore family's final portrait might not have been a coincidence. It might have been the result of those spiritual forces trying to draw attention to their continued presence. She made her way to the basement storage facility, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The basement of the Historical Society was a labyrinth of shelves and storage containers, filled with thousands of artifacts that represented decades of Chicago's history. The lighting was dim, and the air was heavy with the smell of old paper and preservatives. Sarah located the storage area where materials from the 1960s were kept, and began searching for the items that had been received from the Whitmore mansion demolition. She found them in a section that was rarely accessed, stored in a series of boxes that were covered with decades of dust. The first box she opened contained fragments of building materials, pieces of wood, metal, and stone that had been salvaged from the mansion before its demolition. The second box contained what appeared to be personal items that had been found during the demolition process, pieces of jewelry, coins, and other small objects that had been lost or hidden within the building structure over the years. The third box was different. As soon as Sarah opened it, she was struck by a smell that was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was sweet and cloying, like flowers that had been left to rot. But underneath that surface scent was something else, something that made her stomach turn and her head spin. Inside the box were several small containers, each carefully labeled and sealed. The labels indicated that they contained bone fragments, teeth, and other organic materials that had been found in the basement of the Whitmore mansion. One container was larger than the others, and its label indicated that it contained what appeared to be a complete human skull. Sarah's hands were shaking as she carefully removed the container with the skull. Through the clear plastic, she could see that it was indeed a human skull, but there was something wrong with it. The bone was discolored in a way that suggested it had been subjected to some kind of chemical treatment, and there were markings carved into the surface that were definitely not natural. The markings appeared to be symbols of some kind, carved with precision and care into the bone itself. Sarah recognized some of them from her research into Constance Blackwood's background. They were symbols associated with the spiritual practices that the mysterious woman had brought with her from New Orleans. As Sarah examined the skull more closely, she began to feel dizzy and disoriented. The basement storage room seemed to be growing darker, and she could have sworn she heard voices whispering in languages she didn't recognize. The smell from the container was becoming stronger, making it difficult for her to breathe. She realized that she needed to get out of the basement immediately. Whatever spiritual forces had been bound to these remains were still active, and her presence was somehow activating them. She carefully replaced the container in its box and backed away from the storage area, but as she did, she heard something that made her blood run cold. From somewhere in the darkness of the basement, she could hear the sound of digging. It was rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone was excavating with tools. But there was no one else in the basement with her. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, as if several people were digging simultaneously in different parts of the storage facility. Sarah ran for the stairs, not caring about the noise she was making or the artifacts she might be disturbing in her haste to escape. As she reached the stairwell, she looked back and saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the dim light of the basement, she could see figures moving among the storage shelves. They appeared to be people, but there was something wrong with them, something that made her mind refuse to process what she was seeing clearly. The figures seemed to be translucent, as if they were made of mist or shadow rather than solid flesh. They moved with purpose, carrying what appeared to be tools and containers, as if they were engaged in some sort of excavation or ritual work. As Sarah watched in horror, one of the figures turned toward her, and she could see that its face was that of a young woman with features that matched the description of Anna Kowalski from the police reports. The figure's mouth opened as if it was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, Sarah heard a voice that seemed to come from inside her own head, speaking in accented English that suggested the speaker had been born in Eastern Europe. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "I have been trapped here for so long. They use my bones, my spirit, to feed their hunger. I cannot rest until the debt is paid, but I do not know how to pay it. Please, you must help me find peace." Sarah burst through the door at the top of the stairs and found herself back in the familiar, well-lit environment of the Historical Society's main floor. Her heart was pounding, and she was covered in sweat, but she was safe. She immediately called building security and reported that there might be intruders in the basement. But when the guards investigated, they found nothing unusual. The storage area where Sarah had discovered the remains was exactly as she had left it, with no signs of disturbance or excavation. The guards found no evidence that anyone else had been in the basement, and they suggested that Sarah might have been experiencing stress-related hallucinations brought on by working too many long hours. But Sarah knew what she had seen and heard. The spiritual forces that had destroyed the Whitmore family were still active, and they were connected to the remains that were stored in the Historical Society's basement. The discovery of the photograph had somehow awakened these forces, and they were now seeking new vessels for their influence. More importantly, Sarah had made contact with the spirit of Anna Kowalski, the innocent victim who had been sacrificed to pay for the Whitmore family's spiritual debts. Hannah's spirit was trapped, bound to her physical remains, and forced to serve the entities that had claimed her life more than a century ago. The only way to free her was to find a way to resolve the spiritual debts that kept her bound. Sarah spent the next several days researching methods for dealing with spiritual forces of the type that Constance Blackwood had specialized in manipulating. What she learned was that the kind of debt magic that had been used on the Whitmore family could only be resolved through specific rituals that required knowledge and materials that were extremely difficult to obtain. The spiritual debts that had been transferred to Anna Kowalski were not simply obligations that could be forgiven or forgotten. They were active forces that required regular feeding through the suffering and destruction of human lives. As long as Anna's remains were bound to these forces, they would continue to seek new victims to sustain their existence. The only way to break the cycle was to perform a ritual of release that would free Anna's spirit from its bondage and send the spiritual forces back to whatever realm they had originally come from. But such a ritual required not only specific knowledge and materials, but also a willingness to take enormous personal risks. Sarah realized that she was probably the only person who understood the true nature of what was happening, and who had access to the materials that would be needed for the ritual. The responsibility for resolving a century-old injustice had fallen to her, and she could not ignore it without risking the safety of everyone who might come into contact with the cursed remains. She began making preparations for the ritual, gathering the materials and knowledge that would be needed to free Anna Kowalski's spirit and banish the forces that had been feeding on human suffering for more than 100 years. It would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee that she would survive the attempt, but she knew that it was the only way to prevent the cycle of destruction from continuing. The research process took weeks, as Sarah delved into obscure texts and consulted with experts in folklore and comparative religion. She discovered that the type of debt magic practiced by Constance Blackwood was known by different names in various cultures, but the underlying principles were remarkably consistent across different traditions. The key to breaking such a binding lay in understanding the specific terms of the original agreement and finding a way to fulfill those terms without causing further harm. In the case of the Whitmore family, the spiritual debts had been accumulated through a series of interventions that had saved them from various misfortunes. Each intervention had required a payment not just in money, but in spiritual energy that had been extracted from innocent victims. Anna Kowalski had been chosen as the final victim because her death would provide enough spiritual energy to settle all of the family's accumulated debts at once. But the ritual had been designed to transfer the debts to Anna rather than actually paying them, which meant that the spiritual forces involved were still owed the energy they had been promised. The only way to truly resolve the situation was to find a way to pay the debts without requiring additional human sacrifice. Sarah discovered that this could be accomplished through a ritual of substitution in which symbolic offerings were made to represent the spiritual energy that was owed. But the ritual required precise timing and specific materials, and any mistake could result in the spiritual forces claiming the life of the person performing the ritual. Sarah also learned that the ritual had to be performed at a location that was spiritually significant to the entities involved. Since the original binding had taken place at the Whitmore mansion, and since that building had been demolished, she would need to find another location that had a strong connection to the spiritual forces she was dealing with. The obvious choice was Graceland Cemetery, where Constance Blackwood was buried and where the Whitmore family had taken their final photograph. The cemetery had been the site of the original agreement between the family and Constance, and it would provide the spiritual resonance necessary for the ritual to be effective. But performing such a ritual in a public cemetery would be extremely difficult and potentially dangerous. Sarah would need to find a way to access the cemetery at night, when she would be unlikely to be disturbed, and she would need to be prepared for the possibility that the ritual might attract unwanted attention from both human and non-human sources. As she continued her preparations, Sarah began to experience strange phenomena in her own home. Objects would be moved from their proper places. She would hear voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, and she would sometimes catch glimpses of figures in her peripheral vision that would disappear when she turned to look at them directly. She realized that her research into the Whitmore case had attracted the attention of the spiritual forces that were bound to Anna Kowalski's remains. They were becoming more active as the anniversary of the original tragedy approached, and they were trying to influence Sarah to abandon her plans for the ritual. But Sarah was determined to see her mission through to completion. She had made a promise to Anna Kowalski's spirit, and she intended to keep it regardless of the personal cost. The young woman had suffered for more than a century because of the Whitmore family's selfish decisions, and she deserved to find peace at last. On the night of October 13th, exactly 130 years after the Whitmore family had taken their final photograph, Sarah returned to Graceland Cemetery. She had chosen this date deliberately, knowing that the anniversary of the original tragedy would be when the spiritual forces were at their strongest and most vulnerable to the kind of intervention she was planning. She had spent weeks studying the rituals that Constance Blackwood had used, learning how to reverse the processes that had bound Anna Kowalski's spirit to the forces of debt magic. The ritual would require her to make direct contact with those forces, putting her own soul at risk in order to negotiate Anna's release. Sarah made her way through the cemetery in the darkness, using a small flashlight to navigate between the headstones and monuments. She had memorized the location of Constance Blackwood's grave from her earlier research, and she found it without difficulty, despite the poor lighting conditions. The elaborate headstone was exactly as it had appeared in the Whitmore family photograph, with its weeping angel and ornate floral carvings. But in the darkness, the monument seemed to take on a more sinister appearance, as if the carved figures were watching her with malevolent intent. Sarah set up her materials around the grave, creating a circle of protection using symbols and substances that she had learned would provide some measure of safety during the ritual. She lit candles and burned incense, filling the air with smoke and flickering light that transformed the familiar cemetery into something that felt ancient and otherworldly. As she began the ritual, speaking words in languages that felt foreign on her tongue but somehow familiar to her spirit, Sarah felt the presence of the forces that had destroyed the Whitmore family. They were ancient and hungry, and they had been waiting for someone like her to come and offer them a new bargain. But Sarah was not there to make a deal with these forces. She was there to break the chains that had bound Anna Kowalski's spirit for more than a century, and to send the forces back to where they belonged. The ritual was long and exhausting, requiring her to maintain her focus and determination even as the forces tried to tempt her with offers of power and knowledge. As the ritual progressed, Sarah began to see visions of the events that had led to the Whitmore family's destruction. She saw Charles Whitmore making his first desperate visit to Constance Blackwood's mansion, seeking help for his dying son. She saw the family's growing dependence on Constance's interventions and their gradual realization that each favor came with a price that was higher than they had anticipated. She saw Anna Kowalski's final moments as the young woman was lured to her death by promises of employment and a better life. She saw the ritual that had bound Anna's spirit to the spiritual forces and the horror on the Whitmore family's faces as they realized what they had agreed to. Most disturbing of all, she saw the events of October 13th, 1891, as the Whitmore family took their final photograph at Constance Blackwood's grave. They had been trying to complete a ritual of protection, hoping to shield themselves from the consequences of their actions. But the ritual had failed, and the spiritual forces had claimed their lives just hours later. As the ritual reached its climax, Sarah felt Anna Kowalski's presence in the cemetery with her. The young woman's spirit was weak and confused, having been trapped and tormented for so long that she had almost forgotten who she had been in life. But Sarah was able to communicate with her, to explain what had happened, and to offer her the freedom that had been stolen from her so long ago. The moment of Anna's release was accompanied by a sound like thunder that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The spiritual forces that had been bound to her remains let out a collective shriek of rage and frustration as they were pulled back into whatever realm they had originally come from. The cemetery was filled with a wind that had no source, and Sarah felt as if she was being pulled in multiple directions at once. When the ritual was complete, the cemetery fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the area around Constance Blackwood's grave was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and resolution that Sarah had never experienced before. Anna Kowalski's spirit had been freed, and the forces that had fed on human suffering for more than a century had been banished. But the ritual had taken a tremendous toll on Sarah. She felt drained and disoriented, as if part of her own life force had been consumed in the process of freeing Anna's spirit. She carefully packed away the materials she had used for the ritual and made her way back through the cemetery, moving slowly and carefully in the darkness. As she reached the cemetery gates, Sarah turned back for one last look at Constance Blackwood's grave. In the distance, she could see a faint figure standing beside the headstone, a young woman in the simple dress of a domestic servant. The figure raised her hand in what might have been a gesture of gratitude and then faded away into the darkness. Sarah returned to the Historical Society the next day, feeling exhausted but satisfied that she had accomplished what she had set out to do. She made her way to the basement storage facility, where she found that the containers holding Anna Kowalski's remains had been transformed. The bone fragments were still there, but they no longer emanated the oppressive spiritual energy that had made them so disturbing to be around. She carefully sealed the containers with symbols that would prevent any future spiritual attachment and arranged for them to be transferred to a consecrated burial ground where Anna's remains could finally rest in peace. The bones would no longer serve as a conduit for forces beyond human understanding. As she left the basement for the final time, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A simple photograph had led her to uncover a century-old tragedy and to right a wrong that had been festering in the shadows of Chicago's history. The Whitmore family's final portrait had been more than just a historical curiosity. It had been a call for justice that had waited more than 100 years to be answered. The photograph itself seemed different when Sarah looked at it again. The family's faces no longer held the same expression of desperate fear that had first caught her attention. Instead, they seemed peaceful, as if they had finally found the forgiveness they had been seeking when they posed for their final portrait at Constance Blackwood's grave. Sarah filed her official report on the Whitmore collection, noting the historical significance of the photograph and the family's tragic story. But she kept the true details of what she had discovered and what she had done to herself. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, and some responsibilities were too important to delegate to others. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself thinking often about the lessons she had learned from her investigation into the Whitmore family's fate. The photograph had taught her that even the most innocent-looking historical artifacts could conceal dark secrets, and that the past was never truly past, as long as its injustices remained unresolved. She also reflected on the nature of the spiritual forces that had been involved in the Whitmore tragedy. They had been neither good nor evil in any conventional sense, but rather entities that operated according to their own alien logic and morality. They had offered the Whitmore family exactly what they had asked for, but they had never concealed the true cost of their services. The real tragedy was not that the Whitmores had encountered these forces, but that they had been so desperate to avoid the natural consequences of life's hardships that they had been willing to sacrifice an innocent person to preserve their own comfort and security. Their deaths had been the inevitable result of their own choices, not the arbitrary cruelty of supernatural entities. Anna Kowalski, on the other hand, had been a true victim, someone who had been destroyed not because of her own actions, but because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her suffering had been prolonged for more than a century because no one had understood what had happened to her or had cared enough to investigate her disappearance. Sarah realized that her role as an archivist was not just to preserve historical artifacts, but to give voice to those who had been silenced by time and circumstance. Every photograph, every document, every artifact in the Historical Society's collection represented real people who had lived and died, loved and suffered, hoped and despaired. The Whitmore family photograph would remain in the collection as a reminder of these truths. It would serve as a warning about the dangers of seeking easy solutions to life's problems, and as a testament to the importance of remembering those who had been forgotten by history. But most importantly, it would stand as proof that even the darkest secrets could eventually be brought to light, and that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. The photograph that had once been a cry for help had become a symbol of redemption, showing that even the most tragic stories could have endings that brought peace to those who had suffered. Sarah kept a copy of the photograph on her desk as she continued her work, a reminder of the responsibility that came with her profession and the power that historical artifacts could hold. She knew that there were other secrets waiting to be discovered in the Historical Society's vast collection, other injustices that needed to be addressed, other voices that needed to be heard. The Whitmore family's story was over, but Sarah's work as a guardian of history was just beginning. She had learned that the past was not a fixed and unchangeable thing, but a living force that continued to shape the present in ways that were both subtle and profound. Her job was to ensure that the lessons of the past were not forgotten, and that the voices of the silenced were finally allowed to speak.